Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special podcast. I was having a little bit of a tech issue launching here, so there was a moment of silence, but happy International Women's Day. And we are having a discussion about the business case for equity in engineering and why we need more than equality of opportunity. And this podcast recording, this live podcast recording, is hosted by ENGGYAC and Pros&Babes. And today I have two fantastic engineers with me, Kirsten Eeuwes and Amanda Robertson, who are going to be chiming in on the conversation. We have quite a few specific topics mapped out for you, from personal protective equipment to bringing your whole self to work, tackling microaggressions, and even the slight controversy around using the term the business case for equity, right, in diversity and equity in engineering and those spaces. So without further ado, let's first start by introducing ourselves. My name is Kinia Romanowska. I'm a mother of two, and I'm the owner of the company Pros&Babes. We're an education and media company focused on working moms in STEM and STEAM, and we've been running since 2017. And what I do there, I leverage my journalism and entrepreneurial skills to help leaders, creators, and STEM professionals build more mother and family-friendly infrastructure for generations to come. And I would like to also ask Kirsten to introduce herself, and then we'll go with Amanda, and we will jump right in defining equity and equality.
Sure. So I'm Kirsten Eeuwes. I am an electrical engineer and a mother of two. I currently work as a manager of integrated planning and analytics at EPCOR, which is part of their asset management team in the transmission group. And yeah, I'm also a member of the Pros&Babes Mom BA program. And so I'm excited to have this conversation today about equity.
Thank you for joining us. Amanda.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Amanda Robertson. I'm actually also a mother of two. I am an engineer as well. I have worked pretty much my whole career with ATCO. I've been there for almost 13 years now, and I just moved actually into a new role. So I'm with a smaller company within ATCO called ATCO Infrastructure Services. The majority of my career was in the utilities, and now I'm moving more into the non-regulated world. And yeah, I'm just really excited to see how this conversation progresses, because I think, all of us have seen progress in the last number of years, but I think there's a little ways to go. So I'm excited to have this conversation.
Absolutely. And I think it's fun to point out that collectively we are the moms of 6 boys, right? 5 and under. So there's a lot of stake in terms of what we want to show them, to teach them, to be ourselves, and to experience in our lives as professionals, right? So to kick off our conversation, I think it's going to be useful to make a distinction between the words equality and equity. I think many of us are familiar with the term equality, but equity, what does that mean? Kirsten, you shared a lovely graphic with us, right? A nice cartoon that depicts the difference. Could you please define those terms to start off?
Sure. So I think most people are familiar with the word equality more. So equality, word equal is right in it. So it's treating everyone exactly the same. No matter what you're doing, everyone gets the same thing. Whereas equity, on the other hand, tries to look at what the specific needs of people are in order to bring them to sort of an equal level. So the graphic that you were alluding to is a picture of 3 people standing at a fence, and some of them are shorter than others. And so equality would mean I'm going to give everyone the same box to stand on to see over the fence. Everyone gets a box that's 2 feet tall. But equity would mean I'm going to give everyone a different size box that meets their individual need to see a fence. So one tall person might get a 2-foot box, but a short person might get a 4-foot box. And now everyone gets to the same level. They can all see over the fence.
Yeah. And there was another picture too that was showing actually the wooden fence being removed and turned into a grid fence, I suppose, right, through which you could see through, and that represented removing the systemic barriers that was preventing equity and equality in the first place. So thank you for that definition. When we're talking about the term business case for equity or diversity, when we started researching that topic to prepare for today's conversation, I didn't realize, but I should have realized that it would come with a bit of controversy. Actually, there's some people saying, now the business case has been proven. Let's get beyond the business case. It's good for humanity in general, right? What this research reveals is that linking diversity efforts to corporate profits may be a turnoff for the underrepresented individuals the organizations are trying to attract, right? And those people might feel like they belong less in an organization. So I think for the purpose of this conversation, we want to acknowledge that this is not a one-size-fits-all conversation, that it's not simple, that probably at the beginning of the conversation, it's important to make a business case because businesses have to make profits, right? And look at bottom lines. But I think the discussion has to evolve beyond that. And I think we want to present that today. Ultimately, at Pros and Babes, what we want to do is to remind ourselves that we need to design the world as women as well. And whenever I ask that question, it makes people feel a little bit uncomfortable. How would you design the world as a mother, right? Engineers, you build the world. And I think there's an opportunity to dig deep and see, what do we have to offer? We have cyclicality, right? We have caregiving duties. We approach the world differently. And there's a valid contribution to be there that I think we've just scratched the surface on. And that's why I'm excited to have this conversation with engineers, is you are the builders of the future. And as mothers, you can design a different future and a richer future. So that's why I'm excited to have the conversation. I don't know if many of our listeners have read the book Invisible Women. So Amanda, you will talk about it today, right? And what you found interesting, but I'd like to quote a couple of interesting passages from reviews on the book. What's odd about women's invisibility is that women aren't a minority. They're a majority. They're absolutely everywhere and always have been. But as the author shows, women must live in a society built around men. From a lack of streetlights to allow us to feel safe, to an absence of workplace childcare facilities, almost everything seems to have been designed for the average white working man and the average stay-at-home white woman. Her answer is to think again, to collect more data, to study that data, and to ask women what they want. It's that simple. Well, that's the last sentence that says it's that simple. Maybe it's not that simple in application, but for me, if the listeners today had at least one key takeaway, is start asking yourself what you want, and ask yourself that question over and over and over again. Because through the process, particularly of becoming a mother or a caregiver, we tend to lose ourselves and the needs of others. And we tend to forget that we also have a vision to bring into this world, right? So, we talked about white men, white women. I want to emphasize that I'm not here to pit ourselves against white men or white women. However, I think we want to co-create solutions. I'm quoting research that has been done on the topic and using it as a starting point. So Amanda, Kirsten, based on the quotes above, in a nutshell, why do you think we need more than equality of opportunity in engineering? Amanda, if you wanted to start, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. So I think ultimately what equity comes down to for me is enabling diversity of thought. So even though I love celebrating International Women's Day, for me, it's a lot more about diversity, and not just about women, but anyone who identifies as women, transgendered. Like, I think a lot of those things, it gets more gray, and it's harder to talk about because there's so many smaller nuances, as you mentioned, Kinia. But at the end of the day, in terms of engineering, I think one of the things that we do as engineers is we have to come to an optimal solution. And a lot of times the criteria we have are not, they're opposing each other. So as an example, like a very simple example, you might have to design something that's cheap and is also high quality. But that typically, those two things typically do not go hand in hand. So where do you come up with this optimal solution? And so I think where we come back to equity and diversity of thought is being able to have these different perspectives that allow you to realize what your blind spots are. You're not going to be able to design something that's perfect for everyone. And, we can talk about that more with Invisible Women, but like in the end of the day, if you're aware of what your blind spots are, what you're designing for, you can at least prevent groupthink and unintentionally harming or, ignoring certain aspects of the population, or, like it comes really down to being really intentional about our actions and the way we shape the world.
Absolutely. Thank you. Kirsten, what about you? Why do we need more than equality of opportunity in engineering?
So for me, I don't think that equality necessarily allows people to flourish at their full potential. So again, like if you're only giving everyone the exact same accommodations or the exact same salaries or the exact same everything, it's not going to necessarily mean that everyone feels seen, valued, and heard. And then if someone doesn't feel seen, valued, and heard, they're not going to be able to contribute on these teams, Amanda was saying, to bring their innovation, creativity, and have that teamwork really come alive.
I can say now it's been years, but ultimately I did end up leaving a workplace that did not support this type of diversity and equity and opportunity to bring all my talents in a season of life where I would have appreciated some flexibility, right? I had a son with health issues, and it was hard to have the same schedule that I did before having kids. So it does make a difference as moms at the table. What would equity look like for moms? We can also talk about fathers, of course, because we need everybody at the table to embrace their caregiving duties to move the needle in the right direction. But what would equity look like mothers, for example, in those childbearing years, right? During the parental leave transitions, when we are transitioning children to childcare, to school, when there are a lot of germs, when we're sleep deprived, and yet we have also a much stronger sense of wanting to contribute to the world through our professions. Right now we have this sense of purpose. We're keeping these little kids alive. So what does equity look like, Kirsten, for mothers and women in their childbearing years? And if you want to talk about fathers as well, if you find that helpful, please do, or other caregivers.
So for me, one of the key things that I've found helpful is the flexible working hours and also flexible working locations. So I think for most caregivers, they can understand that there's a lot of needs that come in and unexpected events. For example, I go to sleep tonight and at 2 a.m, my kid was puking, and now I don't have childcare for them tomorrow because they can't go to daycare. So having that flexibility of being able to say, okay, I need to stay home and I'm going to need to probably flex my hours a little bit. I might not be able to get the full 8 hours in from 8 to 4. That makes a huge difference for me to be able to have equity at work and still feel like I'm able to contribute. I'm able to take advantage of everything that's going on, and and just have that same opportunity that someone who isn't a caregiver has.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think, Amanda? What does that look like for mothers or people who have different experiences of the workplace, right? For example, people of color, people who are of immigrant background. What could that look like to design more equitable spaces for them?
Yeah, I mean, I echo a lot with Kirsten's personal perspective on the flexible work arrangements. I think sometimes for people of color and immigrants and people who just don't feel necessarily that they're able to speak up in their workplace, I think it's really important to realize that even though sometimes workplaces will say that they have flexible arrangements, but to actually have role models and leaders who practice these things and actually make it part of the culture, because otherwise it may not really seem like, if you're the only person who's getting up at 4 p.m. and leaving your workplace because you have to go pick up your kids, if you're the only person who's doing that, even though your workplace said it's okay, is it really okay? So I think, to help those people who may not have the privilege that others may have, it's so important just to really have that culture that's part of the workplace as well. Yeah,
absolutely. We had a couple more notes about why equal opportunities are not enough. So Kirsten, do you have anything to add there about the ability to take advantage of equality of opportunities?
So I think it was somewhat similar to what I was saying. So if you if there's a networking event and you're holding it at 6 p.m., that's probably not going to fit into the life of everyone. Same thing, like if you're having a meeting and you want to have it at 7:30 in the morning, that's also challenging. So I think that's where I wanted with this conversation is like the opportunity to attend an event, you could say is equal to all, but that's not really necessarily true when you look at the constraints that people have in their lives.
I was smiling when you said that because I remember that being part of a women in leadership group when I was pregnant with my first child. And I thought all the events are at a time where moms are putting their kids to bed. And we haven't created events that would allow for strollers or for kids to play. And I was thinking, how can I stay involved in this movement after I have children? It's going to be impossible. And so I was really passionate about designing opportunities where moms who have a baby in their arms can attend and still feel connected, right? And that's in a way how Pros and Babes was born, and why our sessions are at the times that they are, so that moms can attend even when their hands are busy and full. Amanda, I think you had some notes about people starting off at different starting lines, right? Is there, you say equality sounds really good on paper, but when it comes into practice, what happens?
Yeah, exactly. So like it sounds really nice, but I think one of the things that really comes to mind is that when you have certain barriers, a lot of times it's not that you just have one barrier, especially with like lower socioeconomical type situations. It's not just one thing that's making life hard, it's everything. So if you imagine having access to a reliable vehicle, you can get places very easily. You can get to lots of places. It's relatively easy to bring young kids. So you have to zip from the grocery store to a pharmacy to drop off something at your aunt's house or something like that. Like that's pretty doable within an hour, even with small children. Now imagine if you have to take the bus because you don't have a vehicle. This could all of a sudden take your entire afternoon. And so it's not just the vehicle, but yeah, like now you have kids that you're bringing along. And then now, like it's just multiple things that layer up. Then now you have less time to get the rest of your day done. So it's just I think it's just the fact of like, once there's like a barrier in place, it's sometimes not enough to just remove one barrier. Sometimes you really have to look and dig a little bit deeper.
Yes. Thanks for that. So that was a good introduction into the topic. Now we want to get into very specific challenges that women can face in engineering professions. Amanda, you chose the topic of personal protective wear, personal protective equipment. Why did you choose this topic?
Yeah, I guess, I had some personal experiences that came to mind. I think it was my first co-op job. I worked up in Fort McMurray, and I remember that the company I was working for required me to buy steel-toe boots, which is, nowadays it's fairly common, but they also wanted a certain ankle height. I think I had to get a 12-inch ankle height. And so I went it was called Mark's Work Warehouse at that time, back then. And so I went in there, and they're like, oh yeah, this is basically the only option that you have. It's this one brand, this one model. And luckily it fit my foot, but I can't imagine, like, say I had extra wide feet, or say they were extra narrow or something and they just weren't comfortable. I would have just been out of luck. I would have had to just buy those boots, put them on, and go to work, because that was really the only footwear that was made at that time. And I think there's more choices out there now. But I remember, yeah, back then, there wasn't a lot of choices. And then the other thing that came to mind is, like, when I was a student, or I can't remember if it was when I was a student or when I had first started after graduation, but I remember having to borrow PPE, like coveralls, basically, from the group borrow bin, basically. And the smallest that they had was a men's small. I'm 5'3", so I was swimming in these coveralls. And so, I had the sleeves rolled up. It was super baggy. The pants I had rolled up. But it was almost at the point where it was just so big that the coveralls themselves were basically a safety hazard. But that's all I had. So that's where I went. I went off, put them on, and went to site for the day. So I think it's just one of those things where it's not just that it's a safety hazard. It was extremely uncomfortable. Like, I felt very self-conscious wearing this like giant coverall thing, and it might have even had like a name patch on it. It might have even had a male's name on it. I can't remember, but it was just, and like the way things are at site, everyone's friendly, but of course they're gonna make jokes and stuff like that. But it's just a very uncomfortable place, especially when you're a young engineer just starting your career. It's not really you don't want to be the central attention in that way.
What's the connection between having the proper protective wear and equity, and what needs to change in work environments?
Yeah, so I mean, really, in the end of the day, it's often talked about that you need the proper tools for the job, and in the end of the day, PPE is no different. It's a tool that you need for the job. And like one thing that I never had to encounter was going to site while I was extremely pregnant and not fitting coveralls, because that's a whole other issue. But I think, by providing PPE that fits people well, whether it's a man or a woman, say there's a really tall guy, he might need extra tall, right? It's no different than having women's PPE in many ways. But having these clothes that fit you make your job, first of all, safe, because that's top priority, but then also just comfortable, being able to go out and feel like you fit in with the rest of the crowd, especially if you're not somebody who necessarily works every day on site. Already going to site can be uncomfortable. And also, I just wanted to give out a shout out to Melissa. She's one of our Pros and Babe community members, and she's actually working on prototyping and hopefully getting a patent actually on some PPE that she's been working on, and it's to allow you to go to the bathroom while you're on site. I know some of the sites I've been to have porta potties, and some of them don't have anything, and so you're going in the bush with a bunch of other men, right? So I just wanted to give her a shout out, and maybe afterwards we'll find her landing page and put a link in the comments. But yeah.
Absolutely. I think that ties in nicely into the question about how do you want to experience the world as a woman, right? And bring your ideas forward and be creative. So Melissa's work is an example of how women are designing a world that works better for them. Amanda, I have a follow-up question. Kirsten, if you want to answer it too. There are so many campaigns that encourage girls to get into STEM fields. The reality is that when you complete that really hard degree and you get into a demanding job in the field, it might not be as welcoming or still evolved or adapted as we would think that it would be at this point. What would you like to tell young women who are just beginning their studies in STEM? And there could be maybe a word of encouragement, but maybe there's also a word of caution to manage your expectations and perhaps adopt a specific mindset when you enter a profession that still has some ways to go to help women thrive. I don't know, Kirsten, would you like to go first, and then we'll go to Amanda?
Sure, I can go first. So I think for me, the first thing is to not feel alone, because you're often the only in the room. And so as a very young professional, you don't really know what you can or can't say in these weird situations that you're facing. So I would say for the younger group to just find another female somewhere, anywhere. It could be a different company even, have as a mentor or someone to bounce things off of. I was actually just listening to a Pega's panel yesterday, and one of the female engineers was talking about trying to go to the field, and her boss was completely against it. He was like, well, do you even know how to drive a truck? Well, we would have to get a pink porta potty for you. And saying all these things that, yes, are beyond inappropriate. And so it could, as a young female, you're really like, oh, I even say to this, right? She was great. She ended up going to the next person up and saying, like, what do I have to do to get on site? Like, I want to go to site. But not everyone maybe has that courage without having someone to kind of bounce that idea off of. So that would be my number one recommendation, would be to find someone else and just normalize the experience, but also have some encouragement on how to get beyond those silly barriers that people put in front of you.
Yeah, I think we all had really squirmy faces when you mentioned that incident, because when we go to university and when we're part of these associations, the climate is so progressive in a way, right? More women, more female representation, and then you get into a situation like that and you wonder if you're in a time warp, right? Yeah. Amanda, I might adapt the question to say, what kind of words of encouragement and words of caution would you give a woman who's expecting her first child and maybe is the only one, right? Some women we've met in the Pros and Babes community might have been the first to go on maternity leave in their companies. They are writing the leave policies. Some, I've heard stories of women who did not want to disclose their pregnancy because they would be taken off projects for many reasons, right? Perhaps safety reasons, and then they're concerned about their career taking a hit. So similar question, what would you tell a woman who found out she's pregnant, she's a few years into her engineering career, and she's not sure how announcing the pregnancy will impact her opportunities and what kind of support she'll get from her colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's pretty unfortunate that we have to talk about these things. Sorry, I don't know. Did I lose you guys for a sec there? I don't know if my internet.
Have you? You're good.
Okay,
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, what I was just going to say is that it's unfortunate in many ways that we have to have these conversations, because having a child should be a very normal thing. I mean, humans have been around for I don't know how many thousands of years, but still somehow it can be an issue at work. And so I think in a similar vein as to what Kirsten was saying, I think it's important not to do these things alone. And so whether you're the first person at your company or not, I'd say to try to reach out and find yourself a community, because having kids and being pregnant, like, it's not easy. And then having a career on top of it is also not easy. And I think, you know, by having a community, they can help you think about different considerations that you might want to make. There's certain conversations that you might want to have with your employer. Like, obviously there is the initial announcement, but there's certain conversations that you can have that help control not their reaction per se, but how involved even you want to be during your maternity leave, to let them know whether or not, I mean, this is everyone's personal decision, but whether or not you want to progress your career in the same way that you did before. And you may or may not want to, but if you do want to, I think sometimes it is important to have some intentional messaging around that, because the old, like in the very old school way, depending on what generation you're looking at, once you have a kid, you know, you're kind of out of the workforce after that. And I think, you know, that's not true for any of us sitting in this room here, but and no fault if that is what you want. But I think it's all about kind of trying to come down to what you said, Kinia, about asking yourself what you really want and having a clear understanding of that first before you even talk to your employer. Because I think if you don't come with some clear ideas in your own mind, like even if it's not completely solidified of how, I think if you don't have that vision, it's not going to present a very strong message to your employer.
Yeah. And, you know, for those who don't know where to start, I can give you a bit of a quick framework. Kirsten and Amanda, you've both done that really well, because when you say, what's your vision for your future? And a mom who's newly pregnant, like, I don't know how the baby's going to be. Is the baby going to be healthy? Am I going to have a healthy pregnancy? Am I going to want to go back to work after having a baby? Or some women, you know, feel like they want to go back to work immediately and they miss it tremendously. So it can be a big mystery. But one thing we can tell you, and we do a framework where we do a 25-year visualization, we help you reflect on, you know, your mindset, your relationship with your partner, if that's the case for you, your relationship with your children, your finances, the impact you want to make in the world, right? And your values. So know that your values will likely shift having kids. I've rarely met people who had exactly the same values before and after kids. Typically, even if you absolutely adore your career, you know, you want to focus on family happiness and health. That takes on a whole new level of importance and focus. So if you don't know where to start, having a vision of holistic success longer term can help you have that bigger sense of conviction that you walk into a room with your employer and, you know, you can have an inkling, like, I'm really passionate about the mission of our work, and I'm going to keep an open mind as to how engaged I'm going to be in the first months, right? And let's communicate about it. That can send already a strong message that you've reflected, that you're thinking about the future, and that you love what you do, right? But you're open to change. So thank you for sharing, Amanda. I'll have another question for you, and then we'll talk with Kirsten about showing up as your authentic self at work. There's a really important book that some of you have brought to our conversations of working moms, and that's Invisible Women. And at first read, that book made me, well, some of the takeaways made me really angry and made me realize how much work we have to do in terms of studying women, understanding women from a scientific perspective, designing cars, counters, medicine, frameworks that actually take us into consideration. So, Amanda, what were your key takeaways from the book Invisible Women?
Yeah, I just have to say it's such an amazing book. But I saw this on a book review. If you have high blood pressure, this book may not be the book to read. Wait till your blood pressure is a little bit lower because it can be a bit frustrating. But basically, what the book covers is a huge variety of how and what the impacts are of when the average person or your generic default person is a white male. And I also want to acknowledge that like this also means that like not all males are covered under this, right? There's going to be males who are a visible minority, or maybe they're on average size, maybe they're unusually big or small, and all of a sudden the world is also not designed for them as well. And I think I just want to give a shout out to those people and the transgender people as well, because the book doesn't really talk about those, but I think, this book they basically had to create a starting point to have this discussion. But she basically goes through a huge variety of instances in our world where the world's just not designed for us. So some of the ones that really struck me was, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But I think one of the ones that we were talking about was with snow plowing, and how the person who did, scheduled all the snow plows, they're like, okay, I drove to work today. It was really hard. We need to get the snow plows out there right away. And so like, that's a very innocent thought. But when it comes down to it, looking at the data, the people who are actually more often get injured are the people who are using the sidewalks and the bike trails. And often the people using sidewalks and bike trails are, women or people with a lower social status, again, where they maybe don't have access to a vehicle. So it's just these little things that aren't necessarily intentionally against anybody, but it's just that it causes barriers for other people. One of the other ones that really struck me was dosing of medication. So when you go and you grab your Tylenol bottle and it'll say like 1 to 2 tablets or whatever for an adult. What is an adult? It's a white average male. Another one is seatbelts. That's designed for the average height and weight of a male body. And then one that I came across from work, actually, looking at ground grid design. So when you have a substation, you have to have a certain amount of copper underground in order to prevent basically electrical shock is a very easy way to explain it. But the grounding standards, even by IEEE, the main standard is for a 70 kilogram person. And so for me, I know that this is much higher than what I would actually weigh. And so it may be higher or lower for other men and stuff like that. But as you decrease the weight, that actually decreases your margin. So if you're doing a study, as an example, and your margins are very thin, it's actually more dangerous for a lighter weight person out there than it is for a heavier person. So it's just some of these things, it's like you don't really realize that they're out there. We take a lot of the design in the world around us for granted, but there actually are big impacts. In the end of the day, there's more fatalities for vehicle accidents when your seatbelt isn't designed for your height and weight. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think of all the times where I've tried to walk my kids to school in the winter and it's not possible because the sidewalks are not cleared, and I find myself walking on the road, right? Which are only, yes. So highly recommend considering a book like this for when you think about the business case for equity and engineering. We need a world that's built to represent the people that inhabit it, right? Not just in the light of one, really, at the end of the day, a minority group, right? At the end of the day, we would suppose, again, with all love, we are all married to white men and have children and boys, but they are not a majority, and yet the majority of the world seems to have been designed through their lens, through maybe not through malice, but simply through human nature. So, Kirsten, before I ask you any thoughts about the book and any key takeaways, I guess, well, actually, so Amanda, you gave that example. The book's most compelling passages discuss the consequences of the absence of sex disaggregated data. The author describes the snow clearing schedule in the town of Karlskoga, Sweden, where the major traffic arteries are plowed first and pedestrian walkways and bicycle paths are cleared last. Why is this sexist? Men tend to work outside their homes and travel to work in cars or buses, while women are far more likely to walk with a child to school, sometimes wheeling other children in strollers. So a seemingly innocuous snow clearing schedule, together with the disproportionate burden of caregiving that falls on women, puts women in a double bind, right? So we have other examples around public toilet facilities or the life and death consequences of scant sex disaggregated data and medical research. So that in itself makes the business case for equity in designing the world very, very compelling. Kirsten, anything else you'd like to add on what we discussed in Invisible Women?
So I think the medical side is definitely one of the scariest ones for me, even just thinking about the campaigns from Heart and Stroke Foundation and things about like how does a heart attack present in a woman? Like so much educational information was out there originally and it was all about men. And then finally someone realized, wait a second, women have totally different symptoms. Like we need to talk about this. So we're catching up, thankfully. But I think out of this whole conversation, what I take the most is that there is such a majority that's not represented. So right now we're talking about women because it's International Women's Day, but there's so much more out there that we need to start designing for, of all different shapes and sizes and abilities. So that's what I take out of this. This is more than just women.
Yes, absolutely. And we are, as a group of working moms and engineers, coming together in the spring to design a village through the eyes of a mother, right? We're going to do the exercise for ourselves. What kind of work schedules do we want to design? What kind of roads, what kind of houses, what kind of spaces to interact? I think it'll be really fun for us to do that exercise, and we'll discover a lot about what's possible and how we shouldn't take for granted how the world is designed, right? We can design the future, even though I sometimes feel kind of impatient and tired that it's taking long, but at least it gives us a purpose and a calling. So Kirsten, you wanted to touch upon the topics of showing up as your authentic self, microaggressions, and energy management. Why did you choose these topics for today's conversation about equity in engineering?
So I think these topics are really important to me because they represent the most critical aspects of equity, where we need to tie inclusion and belonging into the discussion. So we have as much equity as we want, but well, actually, I don't even think we could really we couldn't really feel equitable until we have that. So as a manager at work, as a leader in my life, I feel like people need to feel valued and respected. And they need to feel like they actually have influence on their decisions and changes in order to build meaningful relationships with others. So if the part about safety and showing up as your authentic self, if I don't feel safe to show up as myself, then how will I feel safe to speak up in a meeting when something doesn't feel right or seem right? How will I feel safe to show up at that team building event and build those relationships with my colleagues? So there's so much more to actually getting the benefits of diversity by bringing inclusion and belonging into the discussion. So that leads me to microaggressions, because microaggressions are small comments, but they can make a really big impact. And one video that I recently watched was where they compare microaggression to mosquito bites. And living in Canada, I think we've all had our fair share of mosquito bites. So hopefully we can all relate to this. But essentially what they're saying in this video is like an able-bodied cis white male, they might get a mosquito bite now and then. Someone says something that kind of feels wrong to them, but it doesn't really bother you. You kind of scratch it, it goes away. But other minorities, they might have these microaggressions or mosquito bites affecting them every day. So maybe they get 10 bites a day. And suddenly they're so itchy all day long, and all they can focus on is like this discomfort that they're feeling from all these mosquito bites. So when you're constantly feeling itchy, like how can you actually bring your best self to work? So I thought it might be good to give some examples, because I personally actually do find sometimes the hard line between, like, is this a microaggression? Is this pure sexism? Is this pure racism? I don't know, but I think some examples that I've thought about is, like, people asking me, when are you having kids? Are you going to have another kid? What are you doing about kids? And I'm like, oh, like, you're not asking my male colleagues that, and that's bothering me. Like, this has to do with my work conversation. Or something that recently bothered me, I came back to work and people were like, wow, you're looking really good after having a baby. Like, that's awesome. You're nice outfit. And I'm like, why are you talking to me about my body shape? Like, how does this have anything to do with work? What if I wasn't looking good? Would you be like, whoa, Kirsten, whoa, you really need to work on that pre-baby body? So those are the kind of things that it's just like, oh, this is bothering me and you're distracting me from feeling like I belong.
It's happened to me too, the comments about the body, that, hey, have another piece of cake or donut, you're eating for two. I think this is a great opportunity, especially the questions about kids. It's a great opportunity to raise awareness about how childbearing journeys are not straightforward. Many women today have lost pregnancies, multiple pregnancies. Maybe they are going through hormonal treatments to conceive. It is a very, very sensitive topic. And I know that in the beginning, when you come across things like that, people might get really uncomfortable and scared and even avoid talking about families and showing compassion to others or curiosity. There's no simple answer here, but I think it's very important to raise awareness about the fact that any questions related to having kids, growing your family, pregnancy, you only see the tip of the iceberg. What a family went through to get to that point is can be a very emotional space. So please, please get educated on the topic if you're listening to this podcast, and know that there are many ways to be supportive that don't entail asking the questions that Kirsten just mentioned. What about some ethnic pieces? So Amanda, when we talk about diversity hires, I think you may have some thoughts that you may want to share on the topic.
Yeah, I mean, I actually had a negative experience as well that happened to me, where I came into a role. So I was just newly there, and then someone told me that I was a diversity hire. And, like, in many ways, I should have probably just shrugged it off, but I had some past trauma actually from previous work experience where I was already feeling insecure about my abilities and my skills. And so that comment really struck me quite hard, actually. And I think in the end of the day, we talk about equity and having diversity and inclusion. And I think, like, a lot of companies now, especially the bigger companies anyways, are talking more about having a more diverse workplace. But I think in the end of the day, it still comes down to having faith in your own skills, regardless of what other people say, and faith in your own experience, and having the confidence to really stand in your own power. And I do think it takes time. Like, I remember coming out of university feeling really self-conscious, not a lot of confidence. And I think that is a common thing that a lot of women struggle with. So I guess going back to, if I had advice for a young engineer, is just that take a little bit of time to have faith in yourself, because you went through the same training that the guy next to you went through. You can do this just like they can. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that experience, Amanda. I know that it was difficult. And can you tell us a little bit more about how long it took you to process and to make a decision as to how you were going to address the issue with as little or as much detail as you feel comfortable? But you are not alone in experiencing this. And I'm pretty sure that, more people listening to this podcast have unfortunately faced this situation and feel shock. I think in a situation like that, you feel simply shocked and almost frozen. You don't know what to do on the spot. And then a couple of hours later, you come up with things that you would have liked to say. But how did you process this incident, and how did you ultimately make a decision about how you would act?
Yeah, I mean, when when I first heard the comment, I actually was really in shock. I think I didn't really say too much. And actually, I didn't do anything for weeks, but it still bothered me. And I thought about it like every couple of days, and I was like at the point where I think it was like 3 or 4 weeks later, like basically a month later. And I was like, wow, this comment is still impacting me. And it's not like any further microaggressions had occurred or anything like that, but it's just, I realized, this is not really okay. So I ended up bringing it up with my supervisor and working out some resolutions. Ended up talking with the person who made the comment. And actually, yeah, I'm glad in the end of the day, it was a really hard decision for me because I didn't, it's a balance, I guess, between shrugging things off and saying something. And I think for me, it came down to the fact that it still bothered me a month later, that it really was a problem for me. And maybe it's not a problem for everyone. Maybe this is something that some people are more able to shrug off. But for me, because I was still struggling with it a month later, I did decide to bring it up. And I don't regret doing that because I think that what basically helped me make that decision is if I were going to shape a workplace that younger me would be starting at, like a new graduate out of university, what kind of workplace would I want her to come into? And it's not a workplace where she's going to get comments like that. And maybe it will still happen, but I at least know that I took the actions that I needed to try to prevent it, right? And shape the culture. Yeah.
That gives me goosebumps when you said that, and shivers, because these moments take a lot of courage. We don't ultimately always know how our supervisor is going to react. There's sometimes a discrepancy between what a company says on their website and what they value, and then how the individuals actually act in a workplace. And, we discussed your personal brand, we discussed your vision and your values. And ultimately, when you're in a tough situation like that, you can move with more confidence and feel like do what feels very risky in the name of something bigger, even if maybe the outcome would have been different, right? And maybe you wouldn't have gotten the support. It would still have taught you some valuable lessons about yourself, what you value, and the type of workplace you want to be in. Thankfully, I'm glad to hear there was a resolution. But for anybody who is starting off in their career or mid-career, know that having a sense of what world you want to build for yourself and your kids can help you make a decision that feels very uncomfortable after experiencing a shock like this one. So thank you for sharing your story. Kirsten, you, in preparation for a conversation, you brought the report Women as Lovers of Change to our attention. And that report revealed that a 2017 survey of nearly 1,500 US-based female former engineers revealed several issues as their main reason for leaving the profession. The overwhelming majority of respondents cited insurmountable problems around lack of flexibility, long hours, and insufficient pay to cover childcare costs. Kirsten, as a well-respected professional in the field, as a mother of two, what did this mean for organizations who are taking equity in engineering seriously?
Yeah, so this for me, I mean, they very clearly outlined the hours, the flexibility, and the childcare. So childcare, I think in Canada, we're lucky. We're starting to see the childcare costs come down significantly, which is huge help. The long hours and flexibility. So I spoke about this a little bit earlier around having those flexible hours for people to come and go and working from home versus working in the office. So for professionals, I think that's a key thing. I think about the other day where my 1-year-old was up until 2 a.m. And so I only got 4 hours sleep that night. And could I have continued that without flexible work arrangements? I don't think so. Like, I was able to stay home. I was able to stay off the road. I was able to take a rest when I needed to. And that allows me to stay in my career. So as an organization, I would expect that they're going to adopt these kind of policies that allow working parents and caregivers and other things to have these kind of flexible arrangements that can support them. And even I'm thinking about like people telling me they sleep in their cars at lunch to try to catch up on naps, like that if you have a car, but like Amanda said, not everyone has that opportunity. So I think core working hours, something like having core working hours where, you have to be we're expecting you to be available between 10 and 2 or whatever that might look like. And then kind of giving that flexibility outside of it is another thing that an organization could do to show that they're taking equity seriously. Also, one thing I was thinking about today as I was looking at my calendar is Ramadan. Ramadan is coming up right away here. And so I went to a safety meeting this morning. We're serving food and drinks. And I thought, well, it's really good that they decided to have this event now, because I think it would be really unfair to other people who were attending if they had held this during Ramadan and had kind of a similar setup. So energy management as a professional is very challenging, whether you're a female and experiencing monthly cycles, caregiver duties, maybe religious. There's so much going into that. And so that's what I think organizations need to start thinking about when they're trying to retain female engineers.
And I'm glad that you mentioned cyclicality, because for most people, this is a very uncomfortable topic to bring to the workplace. And in our community, we've talked about it and we've studied it, right? And so women's energy rhythms and where we are the most creative and sometimes where we can be most analytical or pull back, that differs. And there are beautiful lessons for energy management when we look at a woman's cycle, right? So I don't think we need to dive into this topic very deeply today, but just raising awareness that there are truly gifts that come with that different disposition and biology, and that I think we can start, bringing the topics into conversations in our families, and also observing how our talents show up at the different levels of our cycle. There's a lot of wisdom to be brought there. Even if you're uncomfortable with the topic, I'm planting the seed with you today to open your mind. Okay, so in that report, Kirsten, there are many case studies showing how women are acting as positive disruptors in legacy industries, energy, oil and gas. Which examples have you found the most supportive for the business case for equity in engineering? I thought these examples were really fun and interesting to see what women are doing in these fields.
Yeah, so I think we talked about having this diversity of people in your company bring diverse ideas and innovations. So one of the examples was bringing corrosion techniques from oil and gas into mining, where it wasn't a common thing. So that was brought forward by a woman. I think women are really good at building community and working in community. Like we typically work in that way. So there's examples of how women are able to build more trust with the communities that the companies are working in through manufacturing and mining and others. And then finally, the last one that I thought was really good was women banding together and creating these support networks, such as Women in Titanium was an example that they had, so that you are able to have that community where even if you might be the only woman on your team or the only woman in that meeting room, you know that there are other women out there doing things that you're doing. So those were the specific examples.
Yes, and so the report is called Women as Lovers of Change. Lovers, am I saying? Sometimes my French-Polish background comes in. I think you know what I mean. You can Google the report and find many examples if you want inspiration. Those are just a few, but they inspire me because I'm so curious about how the world would look like if more mothers, if more women, if more diverse perspective designed it, right? What would our sidewalks, buildings, hospitals, healthcare systems, childcare, what would it look like if we took a moment to think, okay, I have a lot of wisdom and answers in my disposition, right? I can bring something to my industry that's very unique. So wonderful. Okay, we are getting into the last part of our conversation. I know we're getting to the top of the hour. Kirsten, Amanda, are we still good to talk for a couple of minutes, or are you jumping off for meetings?
I'm good.
Yeah, okay, good. Perfect. So we want to tie it all together, really. What can women do to build a more equitable world for themselves and future generations? And what can men do to build a more equitable world? I think I just gave my answer. I would love to see a world that has more of a women and mothers lens in the design. Kirsten, what would it look like for you?
For me, it would be having more women at the table, feeling seen, valued, and heard when decisions are being made. So making sure that and even the way that we parent, having our children feel respected and heard so that as adults, they can model that same behavior. And for me, it's not a zero-sum game. If we focus on inclusion of women or other minorities, it doesn't mean that suddenly the white male is not to be included. Like we said, there's so many different shapes and sizes of white males too. So the more that we can embrace this, the more everyone feels like they can benefit. And it's not an easy thing. I've talked about this with my husband a lot around like trying to do more diversity and inclusion work. And he's like, well, what used to be okay to say yesterday isn't okay to say today. And it's like, yeah, you're right. We're all learning together. We're all growing. So that's the world that I see, is where we're all willing to learn, grow, be confused, take feedback, and just keep improving.
Yeah, the confusion part is so important because these topics can make people feel very uncomfortable. We all make mistakes and blunders and sometimes say something that we thought was okay, but it's not okay anymore today. I think we will, as we are growing in our leadership roles, all of us at the table, we're the next generation of leaders, probably younger people we hire will say, hey, by the way, that's really old fashioned, just get with the game. So I think if we're open to making mistakes, having dialogue, co-designing, iterating, that is very, very important. And Kirsten, I will just correct slightly, actually quoting Invisible Women, we are the majority as women. In fact, we're slightly the majority, right? So that's important to remember, that we also have a say in designing this world. Amanda, what would that look like for you?
Yeah, actually, just before I get to that, I just want to just mention too, because I've talked to so many people where they say, we're scared of talking about XYZ. Like I think it came up a lot too during like Black Lives Matter. Like people were afraid to say anything because they were worried about getting called out or saying the wrong thing and that type of thing. But I think if you come from a place of curiosity and learning, and even if you have a very awkward question that you want to ask somebody, I know there's like pros and cons about this type of thing. And people say that you should do your own research and stuff like that. But I think if you have come to the conclusion that you do want to ask somebody a fairly personal question about, their gender or their race or anything like that, come from a place of curiosity and openness. And if the person wants to answer, they will. But I think if you show that you're genuinely wanting to learn, you're not going to get called out. Like if that's what's happening, that's not right either. Because like we've all said, like we're all here learning. Nobody really knows what the right answer is. And so the bringing that into what I want the world to look like, I think it's really the culture piece that I mentioned of having psychological safety in order for people to speak up, to say what they need. Because in the end of the day, one solution that might work for even the majority of people, even when you try to make it as equitable as possible, it's still not going to be perfect for everyone. But if you come to a place where people feel that they're able to speak for themselves, that's really what I'd like to see.
Yeah, that was a beautiful example, Amanda. I can think of somebody close in my circle who ended up asking the question of a teen who transitioned to a different gender. And it was the first time this teen had received the question. And they said, oh my gosh, thank you for asking. You're the first person to ask me. Whereas the main discourse was like, you shouldn't talk about, you shouldn't ask questions that are too personal. But in this specific case, this person felt very seen and saw this as an opportunity to share their experience, right? So I remember a Harvard Business Review article as well that talked about how you're going to make mistakes and that's okay. And making mistakes when you're coming from a place of curiosity is better than being completely silent too, right? So yes, maybe somebody will say, eat those 2 donuts. You're eating for 2 right now and they're coming from a good place. And hopefully this can be turned into an opportunity for a positive conversation that will empower both people to act better in situations in the future, right? Okay, let's see. Let's look at my notes here. Oh, is it important to make a business case for equity in engineering? Well, to some extent, I say that yes in the beginning, because companies do measure the results from the lens of a business model and a business case perspective. But maybe that's necessarily in the early stages of the discussion. And now we are ready to evolve beyond that, right? And think about the negative consequences of framing business cases for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I still have a lot to learn on the topic. So I'm glad we're having conversations. I'm glad that actually that question is actually slightly controversial and that we are evolving in our answers. So let's be aware that also using the business case for these efforts can backfire, and let's start incorporating that into how we bring up DEI in our spaces. What do we do? What do we do? So this is going to be our closing question. I believe that we need to have the courage to envision a more equitable world, a long-term vision, and your strategic role in it. I think there's a phase of my life, especially when I had really young kids, where I felt like a victim. I was shocked. I thought that I was in a space that was friendly and inclusive, and at the end of the day, I found myself pumping in a dusty room with no chairs and no code, and I was thinking, what is going on here, right? So I went through a phase of shock and feeling like a victim, and I've evolved to want to claim how I want to design the world. And it's not easy, and sometimes it feels heavy, and I'm tired. And I wish that we didn't always have to advocate so much for ourselves, and that there was more allyship and other people with privilege who are saying, hey, we'll pick up the slack. Like, it's not fair for you, it's not equitable. Sometimes it feels like an uphill battle. But at the end of the day, I do believe it's really important to look inside and to believe that you have a vision that's worth bringing forth into this world with your own unique intersection of gender, of caregiving duties, of professional skills, of ethnic background, right? Of faith, all of that. This is your own unique blueprint. And there are other people in the world who need your voice and your creativity. So I think that's one of the steps that I want to contribute to building an equitable world, is asking people the uncomfortable questions. And sometimes they have to ask them 10 times because they've forgotten how to listen to their wisdom and their hearts. At the end of the day, many women, we just force ourselves to blend into a world that wasn't designed for us. We want to break through in our careers. We want to make, enough money and then go on our maternity leave. And you just forget what it means to feel comfortable in your body as a woman and to honor your womanhood and your motherhood. And you just pretend to be someone else for so long that you forget. So it takes courage and sometimes a lot of tears to look inside for that vision. And that's what I'm here to stand for. Amanda, what do we do to build a more equitable world?
I mean, I guess that's a big picture type question, but I think in my day-to-day, what I want to do is provide a safe space for people to come and talk about their challenges and talk about barriers that they're facing. So I do have a small team that reports to me at the moment, but even then outside of that, I work with different engineering teams, I work with customers and all of those types of things. And I hope that they feel open and comfortable to come to me, like on a more personal level. And if there are things that we can work through together, I'd like to be there for them, whether it's moms or dads or people who really don't like kids. Like I don't discriminate in that way, but I do want to be a person who is safe to come to talk to.
Lovely. Kirsten, you had a couple of notes here about engaging senior leadership in the discussion.
Yeah, so I think that the business case is one thing that kind of can help you translate what you're trying to say to senior leaders. Yeah. So that was one thing that I say would be a pro of kind of looking at it from a business case point of view, is just writing down your thoughts. I don't think it's enough to say like, oh, we value diversity, inclusion, and then like Amanda said, all the leaders in the organization show and demonstrate completely opposite. So we need senior leadership engaged in the discussion, especially when we're talking about women in engineering. We need men. We need the men. They're our allies. They're the majority in this case. So we need to elevate, publicly recognize the men that are advocating for gender equity in engineering. Yes. And for kind of to that point of the difficult discussions, if we can give people skills to enter into those discussions with curiosity, and kind of say like, what are examples of things that are totally off limits? Like you will never go up to someone and ask about their genitals, for example. And what are things that are better ways to approach it? So I think giving people skills to have those conversations will also really make a difference. And I guess the last thing I wanted to leave you with was this quote that I read from Deborah Gillis, who is the former president and CEO at Catalyst. And she said, "You give me the business case for an all-white male leadership team, and I'll give you the case for diversity. You go first."
Yeah.
Boom. When you wrote that in our notes, I was thinking that is strong. And I think that's such a wonderful way to wrap up our discussion. I wanted to thank you both. You are very busy professionals with little kids and full plates at work, and you took some time today to have this discussion. That's not an easy one. So for anyone listening and wanting more support, know that we are offering with Pros and Babes a free monthly webinar that's specifically focused on mothers and also fathers at different stages of their careers and when they're childbearing years. So you can go, you have that in the ticker, but it's tinyurl.com/STEM mom. And if you enjoyed this podcast and you want to see more women and mothers building the world, bring Pros and Babes to your employers. The Mom BA will be open for enrollment soon in the spring. So you can reach out to me, Kirsten, or Amanda to find out more. Happy International Women's Day. Let's embrace equity, whether you feel comfortable or uncomfortable with the hashtag, right? I saw a lot in my LinkedIn feed. I think I saw a lot of sad sentiment as well today, as well as celebration. I think there's room for both when we reflect on what our situation in the world is as women. And thank you, Kirsten and Amanda, for your contribution as engineers in the world. I'm so excited that there are mothers designing the future. Have a fantastic afternoon, everyone, and I will see you both backstage.
Thank you.
Thank you.